This video goes over American culture during and around the American Revolution. America experienced rapid population growth and expansion in the 1700s. Many new people, such as Quakers, Catholics, Jewish people, and the Amish, came to America. New colonies were formed, and many of them were based on non-Puritan religious beliefs. We discussed the Puritans in a previous video. With this change, Puritan ideas and beliefs had less influence on broader American culture. From the 1500s to the 1800s, over 380,000 enslaved Africans were brought to North America. During that time, indentured servitude was common in the colonies for both Europeans and Africans. Indentured servitude is when someone signs a contract to get something, in return for doing unpaid labor for a set amount of time. Contracts typically included 4 to 7 years of servitude, passage to America, and the promise of a plot of land when servants were freed. Most white Europeans who came to the colonies from 1500 to 1700 were indentured servants. In the 15 and 1600s, the colonies generally depended on indentured servants and enslaved Native Americans for labor. But in the late 1600s, things changed. Southern states grew crops that were labor-intensive to harvest. The colonies expanded westward, which required a lot of labor, and landowners didn't want to compete with freed indentured servants for land. More African slaves were brought to North America, and African indentured servants began being treated as slaves for life, with no end to servitude. Most white indentured servants had a social and cultural support system, but most African indentured servants did not, which made them easier to enslave. If they managed to escape slavery, their skin color made it very difficult for them to hide. Enslaved Africans were denied basic rights and were more often than not victims of physical and sexual violence, and separated from their families. In the late 1700s, the American Revolution occurred. America wanted to be independent from Britain, and with that came a significant cultural shift. A new American man was born. The American man wasn't an actual man, but the idea of what the ideal American man should be. The American man was bold, assertive, and fearless, but the Englishman was thought of as weak and effeminate. He wore powdered wigs and sipped tea all day. He didn't get anything done, but the American man did. A big part of the American man was serving in a militia. He was a militia hero who fought for his country. But many men couldn't serve in militias, and therefore couldn't be this new American man. Slaves, free Africans, Native Americans, indentured servants, and white men who didn't own property weren't allowed to join a militia. They couldn't be the idealized American man, and they also couldn't be full citizens. At the time, the only men consistently allowed to vote were white men with property. In the 1700s, an intellectual and cultural movement known as the Enlightenment took place. The Enlightenment emphasized science and reason, and rejected faith without evidence. The Enlightenment was also one of the driving forces behind the American Revolution. The Enlightenment is one of the reasons America has a separation of church and state. Ruling had long been tied to religion, from kings claiming a divine right to the throne to laws being based on religious texts. But John Locke, an Enlightenment scholar, promoted the idea of a separation between church and state, which became popular among colonists. Several Enlightenment scholars embraced the idea of personal sexual autonomy, but America did not. Most of America's laws that regulated sex and gender were based on religious scripture, but despite America's embrace of the separation between church and state, those laws were not abolished in the colonies. This is likely because societies that are heavily based on gender tend to strictly regulate sexual norms, and America was heavily based on the idea of the American man. Men and women existed in separate social spheres. Men were a part of the public sphere and associated primarily with other men. They went to work and men's clubs. Women were a part of the private sphere. Part of this is because women couldn't be in public spaces like restaurants or theaters without a male escort. Women often had tea together or went shopping with one another. They also helped each other through pregnancy and childbirth. This culture of same-sex association led to romantic friendships. Close friendships between two members of the same sex. Romantic friendships often existed between two men or two women. Some of these friendships likely had a sexual or romantic component, and some of them were likely just close friendships. Most of the evidence we have of these friendships are from letters. These friendships could last a very long time and were generally socially accepted because they were seen as just close friendships. Sarah Wister and Jeannie Musgrove are an example of a romantic friendship. They met in 1849 when they were teenagers and developed an intense bond. The two went to boarding school together, and while there, began exchanging letters. Jeannie ended one letter with, "1,000 kisses, I love you with my whole soul." The two exchanged these letters for most of their lives, despite marrying men. Romantic friendships were generally socially accepted, but gender deviance was unusual. As a young woman, Deborah Sampson decided she wanted to join the Continental Army. She dressed in men's clothes and bought passage out of town, but she was found out before she could leave. Her town was scandalized. It was not socially acceptable for a woman to wear men's clothes or to attempt to pass as a man. Sampson was not deterred and eventually joined the Continental Army in 1782 under the male pseudonym Robert Shirtlift. She spent at least 17 months as a soldier and was a part of many battles. She eventually fell ill and was honorably discharged. She married Benjamin Gannett and had 3 children. In 1802, she went on tour to talk about her experiences and accomplishments in the war. Partway through the presentation, she would change into her army uniform and perform drills. The demonstrations were very popular. Why were Deborah Sampson's stories and demonstrations popular? During her presentations, the public saw her as a brave soldier and as a traditional woman, 2 roles that would normally contradict one another. She had dressed as a man during the war, but afterwards married and had children. There was a fascinating duality to her. Another interesting case of gender was that of Jemima Wilkinson. In 1775, when she was 23, she fell seriously ill. She recovered and, upon doing so, announced that Jemima Wilkinson had died, but her body was reanimated by God and now inhabited by a genderless spirit known as the Public Universal Friend. The friend refused to answer to Jemima Wilkinson or gendered pronouns such as he and she. The friend wore black clothes and a brimmed hat that made the friend's sex difficult to distinguish. The friend also began preaching about the apocalypse, universal freedom, and complete sexual abstinence. These bold ideas and ambiguous gender presentation made the friend a public sensation. Many newspapers wrote about the friend, and the friend eventually gained a cult following. Deborah Sampson cross-dressed for only a short period of her life, and clearly did so to serve in the Continental Army. After being honorably discharged, she stopped cross-dressing, married, and had children. The friend was very different. The friend refused to have the concept of gender applied to themselves, and preached about the apocalypse. Deborah Sampson broke gender roles in a somewhat socially acceptable way for the time. The friend did not, and yet both captured the fascination of the American public. To review, several colonies were based on non-Puritan beliefs, and the Puritans' influence on America waned. Many people came to the colonies as indentured servants. The colonies had previously relied on indentured servants and enslaved Native Americans for labor, but began to rely more on enslaved Africans for labor, and more enslaved Africans were brought to the colonies. During the American Revolution, the idea of the new American man was created to contrast the Englishman. But men who weren't white or didn't own property couldn't be the American man, or vote. The Enlightenment led to the separation of church and state in the colonies, but America did not abolish its laws regulating sexual behavior. Men and women were a part of different social spheres. This culture of same-sex association led to romantic friendships, which were close friendships between members of the same sex, which may have included a sexual or romantic component. Deborah Sampson and the Public Universal Friend both behaved in unexpected ways regarding gender, and in doing so, fascinated the public. America experienced rapid change during the period of time surrounding the American Revolution.